Hello, everyone. Welcome to this talk on adapting to wildland fire in rural Mediterranean social contexts. My name is Kathleen Uyttewaal. I'm a PhD candidate working at the Pau Costa Foundation in Catalonia, Spain, and I'm affiliated with Wageningen University in the Netherlands. This is all made possible through the PyroLife project, an innovative training network on integrated fire management, funded by the European Union Horizon 2020 initiative and Marie Curie Actions. And I have the real pleasure of working with Drs. Nuria Prat-Guitart, Caroline Koze, Fulco Ludwig, and Lisa Langer. So I want to talk to you today about why local social contexts matter when we're talking about fire, what these might look like in the Mediterranean setting. We'll delve into the Catalan context because that's mainly where I live and work. I'll walk you through some preliminary findings that I'm seeing, some consensus and contention in the stories I've gathered, and to talk you through some next steps because all of this data continues to be very raw. So you're the first to take a look. So what do we know about local social contexts? Rural areas and the wild-and-urban interface are really dynamic and diverse. These places bring together lots of residents with really different values, knowledge, and beliefs regarding wildfire or how private and public land should be managed. And how all of these visions come together to address collective risk is really critical for mitigation, especially when there's a lot of uncertainties around climate change and there's a lot of a strong integration of top-down and bottom-up strategies is necessary. So social context is this really multifaceted concept developed by a lot of authors in the US over many, many years in cases. This particularly by Travis Pavelio and several other authors kind of defines it in 4 leaflets. There's a demographic and structural component of different rural areas, the resident relationships that are present, the scientific and technical knowledge folks have access to, the local fire knowledge and experience present, and how all of these factors interact is going to really determine the kinds of adaptations that these different areas conduct for fire. So knowing all of this can really help develop appropriate pathways that are locally tailored. And we know that these actions are more likely to succeed when they're tailored to emerging patterns of local context. So I think that's really important elsewhere, aside from the US as well, but that research hasn't been developed so much. And full disclosure, I mainly grew up in California in the US, but I've been currently living in Catalonia for almost 3 years and have a lot of ties and experience here. So I wanted to know, what's a first attempt to see what local social contexts look like in rural or semi-rural Mediterranean areas, and how can this inform adaptations to wildfire management? I conducted a literature review, which I won't talk about, but 20 very colorful, semi-structured interviews with experts. And we talked about those kinds of 4 different components of demographic and structural components, access to scientific and technical knowledge, informal interactions among residents, and place-based knowledge. So I'm starting to find points of contention and consensus. I want to account for the diverse realities in these areas while also uncovering some common themes that can help for fire adaptation in the future. So these 4 different areas I was looking at in the Mediterranean fall along a rural and semi-rural gradient. They're areas that experience multiple kinds of risk. They have a lot of experience with wildland fire, and they're undergoing rapid social and ecological transitions. They're representative of land use and value changes, such as a lot of rural abandonment and forestry decline, a lot of increase in industry and tourism. So they're undergoing similar things, and as well as with aging populations. So even though they're very different countries and a lot of governance mechanisms are quite different, there are some themes that I think are important to keep in mind across cases. So let's zoom in to Catalonia. These are just the administrative boundaries of the region, but there's there are all kinds of entities involved in wildland fire management, from the local to regional level. There's, of course, emergency management and fire analysis, local administration that's put in a lot of interesting fire protection policies, even volunteer firefighting groups and nonprofit organizations such as the Cal Costa Foundation, which I work for. And so the areas these interviewees came from was primarily up in the Pyrenees, these rural mountain communities in the Pallars Sobirà, remember that name, and also La Selva, which is down by the coast, and it's a much more semi-rural environment with a lot of expanding urban populations. So really different realities in those two places. Socially, and very different fire realities as well. This is a fire typology map, probably outdated already, but developed by Marc Castelnau and colleagues. He's a fire analyst and fire chief. And there have been a lot of studies on the kinds of fire that are present across Catalonia and other areas of Spain. And up in the Pyrenees, there are mainly winter fires, and it's considered a pretty low risk area, whereas down by the coast, there are a lot more summertime fires, and it's classified as a much higher risk area currently. So let's look at some preliminary emerging patterns. I liked this thought from an interviewee that a lot of conflicts generated at a local level are a lot more universal than many of us would think. So a couple themes coming up. In terms of scientific and technical knowledge, really forward-thinking policies are in place across the board. There's a mix of highly professional and local volunteer management. In terms of demographics, across the board, people shared a lot of concern about fractalized private property ownership. In the case of Catalonia and several other Mediterranean areas, land holdings are very small and have sometimes been passed down for many generations. Someone even told me from the 1100s, and tracing property owners is really difficult in many cases. So this presents a unique challenge in terms of wildland fire management, especially when so much property is privatized in these areas. Then in terms of resident relationships, a lot of interviewees were able to pinpoint some really pronounced resident profiles. Of course, there's a lot of complexity in there, but it seems there are some profiles that could definitely be allies, and some profiles that could definitely use quite a bit more transparent communicating in order to foster more localized fire adaptation. So there's both challenges and opportunities in facilitating bottom-up processes. Then other things that were shared were some struggles in finding common ground with especially environmentalist organizations that may have different perceptions of what land management should look like. Conservation versus active management. It's a debate that reaches far beyond, I think, just Mediterranean areas as well. And there's also quite a concern for disappearing knowledge from elders. People have seen a lot of landscape change. They've used fire in different ways, and that knowledge, in a more qualitative way, hasn't really been gathered to the same extent that it has in other areas of the world. So there's concern that that's disappearing. So those are all of the things that we're finding in common among areas, but I wanted to focus on the hot topic of prescribed fire to show how that's showing up in a really different way in these two areas in particular. Up in the mountain, the Pallars Sobirà, and the Selva down on the coast. And I'm going to use again this great model by Pavelio to demonstrate those different perceptions coming up around prescribed fire. When it comes to resident relationships, in the Pallars, we see a lot of drive to include local populations in prescribed burns, and in La Selva, something quite different. So we'll see in the Pallars, for example, someone shared that some ranchers feel that they've been left on the sidelines. Maybe some people would like to participate more in burning in a safe way and make it feel more their own, because farmers and shepherds used to do this for many, many thousands of years. And now it seems like the sector has become very professionalized, but there's also an element of sort of ignoring local knowledges, even though, of course, local knowledge is developed in a very different setting than what we see today, just based on, massive landscape change. But still, there's this element of trying to incorporate local knowledge that's important for prescribed fire. Then down in La Selva on the coast, we see that a lot of small local actors more and more are hesitant or don't like fire actions. And when it comes to making decisions about management, well, decision makers are going to lean more towards conservative, no management or conservation groups. And that's creating some tension with entities like bombers who want to take more active prescribed fire management in the area. Then when it comes to local, more local experience and local fire knowledge, something that's really interesting across Catalonia is this cultural significance of fire. It's everywhere, but especially still alive in the Pyrenees. There are town festivities called correfocs, or fire runs. Around the summer solstice, there's a festivity called the Fia Falla, and there, people really know what they're doing. People realize the power that they have in their hands, and they feel responsible for it. And that generates this feeling of caution and prudence and celebrating fire as well, which I think is a really beautiful way to look at it. Whereas in La Selva, little local knowledge is communicated, at least with the interviewees I talked to. People don't really imagine prescribed burns as a problem because they can't even conceptualize it. People have been, detained in the past for setting fires to land, and so there's a lot of fear. People spoke to that quite a bit. So information about local knowledge and local practices didn't really translate to the interviewees that I talked to. And here's just a really cool picture of what those fire festivities can look like on the summer solstice. When it comes to scientific and technical knowledge around prescribed fire, it's really interesting that in the Pallars, there's some great cooperation happening between different levels of technical fire management. So between firefighters and between park rangers, there's been a really developing relationship of trust over many years, and they see a lot of opportunities to connect with locals. Whereas in La Selva, there's quite a lot of administrative collaboration and big jumps, a lot of progress being made there. However, there is this perception that socially, they still feel a lot of rejection when it comes to prescribed fire. So big administrative leaps, but not so much translating on a local awareness and participatory level. And finally, when it comes to demographic and social characteristics or structural characteristics, in the Pallars, there's a lot of folks I talked to thought that there could be possible combinations of combining prescribed fire with local forestry activities, such as, renewing biomass pellet industries that could be a lot more localized and create a lot more economic opportunities. And that could also be paired with prescribed burns and having people manage their land more actively. Whereas in La Selva, the kinds of forestry activity that exists there, one of the highest value products over there is cork. And cork loses all of its value when it's burned. So combining forestry and fire use on the private property level just seems to be quite a barrier. So a few key messages. There's a lot of emerging preliminary patterns and divergent details in all of these cases. There's a lot of things I've really learned from these frameworks developed in the US, but there are also emerging themes that are unique to Mediterranean contexts that I'm happy to share in further detail down the line. So the next steps is that I'll complete these thematic analyses across the 4 case studies. I'll be communicating more with local stakeholders and developing a really in-depth case study. The PyroLife project continues until 2024, and more than anything, I would just love to stay in touch and hear your questions and comments on this research as it continues developing. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.